As you can see, this wide array of percussion instruments we're going to learn more about today and hear some wonderful sounds. But before we do, I want to make sure that everybody either silences or turns off their electronic devices as a courtesy to the other audience members and the musicians. And I hope you enjoy.
Thank you very much. We're just going to get in our places here, and as the students come out, let me introduce myself. My name is Kevin Kerberg. I am the chair of the music department at Warren Wilson College, just outside Asheville in Swannanoa, North Carolina. I have been there since 2010 and started this ensemble in 2011. So, is there anyone who knows where gamelan comes from? Yes?
Java, Bali.
Yes, correct, all right. Or Indonesia, right, of which Java and Bali are a part. This particular ensemble is a central Javanese gamelan. So we're going to play a few pieces for you today, and I'll do a little bit of background information kind of as we go. Gamelan does have ancient roots, but it's also a contemporary music with pieces that are written today for it as an ensemble. So it's something that goes back pretty far, but is also up to date. So this first piece we're going to play for you is a traditional piece called Sing in the Ba, which means pouncing lion. And it's a lanchet-on form, and most of the pieces we play will be of this particular form. It's kind of the simplest form of gamelan piece, and it's a typical one you might hear to start off a program like this. You're singing them up. Gamelan is perhaps the most popular Asian ensemble that you'll find in a lot of university programs in the U.S., university and college programs. There are about 150, 175 sets that you'll find in college and university settings. The reason for that is it was one of the first musics to really be studied by people from outside Indonesia, scholars. Some of the earliest ethnomusicologists and pioneers in the field studied gamelan. And the reason for that was Indonesia has been a tourist destination for Europeans, Australians, for over 100 years. It's long been a place where Westerners, you might say, went to spend time. And a lot of it was cultural tourism, where folks would go there to experience the traditional culture of Indonesia. So in addition to Central Javanese gamelan, the other two major styles are Balinese from the island of Bali and Sundanese, which is also from Java, but it's more of the eastern, it's closer to the eastern shoreline of Java. Those three kind of make up the big three styles that are found around the country. But certainly Javanese and Balinese are perhaps the ones that you'll hear a lot of. As close as those two islands are, and they're very close together, the styles can be very, very different. And as you may know, Indonesia is a country made up of islands, literally thousands of islands. I think about 13,000 the last time I checked. And about 500 native languages, from my understanding. So there are other styles of gamelan music, ones that just haven't acquired the popularity that Javanese and Balinese styles have. This particular set is owned by a gentleman named Will Peoples. He's a professor at Western Carolina University. And every set of instruments has a name because they're all the instruments are built at one time, which is pretty fascinating. So you could not take a piece from this gamelan set and put it in another Central Javanese set and expect it to fit. Because they're all made together, they're all tuned together, and there's no standard pitch reference. So the tuning may be a little bit different between two different sets, which is another reason why the instruments are meant to stay together. And that's really a reflection of the community aspect that pervades life in Indonesia in a lot of different respects in addition to music. So the name of this set, and I don't quite know the story behind it, is Kiai Tatrit Ratri, which means venerable night lightning. I was told by Will that it used to be a set that was used for radio performances, and so the idea, I guess, of radio waves, maybe that's where that came from. But it was out in California for a while, and then moved up to the Northwest, and Will acquired it probably, I'd say 15 to 20 years ago. It's a funny story, actually. It was right after eBay came online. And so he and a friend were poking around this weird new site called eBay, just seeing what was out there. And he was like, well, his friend said, well, I wonder what happens if I type Russian submarine. So he typed a Russian submarine, and there was one for sale. And he's like, oh, well, I might as well type gamelan. And sure enough, he types in gamelan, and there's one for sale in Oregon. So that summer, he got a van and drove up to Oregon and bought this particular set. The other thing about the instruments is that they all have a sort of a spiritual essence, and they're gendered. And so, for example, the big gong here is a female gendered instrument, okay, and you have other sort of gendered symbolisms throughout. The set as a whole is also gendered. This happens to be a male set, but there are female sets, which is quite fascinating. After this next piece, I'll kind of go through and talk a little bit about the scale and how that works. But we'll go ahead and play another piece for you. This is called Kendang Bubra, and I teach with a sociology professor at Warren Wilson College who is from Java. She grew up studying classical Javanese dance. So when I arrived at Warren Wilson and started this ensemble, it was so exciting to know that there was a Javanese dancer there. So she often collaborates with us for our on-campus performances or our performances around the Asheville area. Her name is Dr. CCC&TI, and she and I have taken students to Indonesia a couple of times over the past 5 years. And this was a piece we picked up from one of our workshops over there, Kendang Bubra. It's another popular piece. It has a little bit different melody, a little bit more active melody that you'll hear. And the name roughly translates to broken barn. Broken barn. So here's Kendang Bubra. Thank you. So you may have noticed that at the end of these pieces, everybody pauses and waits for the large gong to play, and then they play their last note. And that's out of deference to the gong. The gong is actually the most important, sort of revered instrument in the whole ensemble. It's interesting because the gong plays the least. It only really marks the big cycle as it comes around in the beginning and the end. And these pieces, if you have noticed already, they're very cyclical, as is a lot of aspects of daily life in Indonesia. One interesting way that represents itself in another facet of life is in Bali, for example, people only have 4 names. So your first child is named Wyong. The second child is named Ketut. The third child is named, now I'm going to forget, a couple others, it's escaping me now, but the point is when you get around to child number 5, it's Wyong again. Now there are last names that go with them to identify, but again, it's that concept of cycle that that sort of pervades a lot of the customs and daily life that goes on in Indonesia. So, if the big gong is sort of the spiritual leader of the group, then the kendong, the drums, act as sort of, as one of my teachers said, sort of the CEO. So they're kind of running the show. And so the drums are signaling for different things to happen, the beginning, the end. If on this next piece, we'll actually have a part where these two instruments on your left will start doing something differently, and that's also signaled by the drums. And so that's the function of the drums. Now, these other instruments also all serve really specific roles. And I'd like to just demonstrate the scale for you because that's interesting as well. So these with the 7 keys that you see, 5 of them here, these are carrying the core melody, okay, what's called the balungan. And that's really their function, is to carry the core melody of the piece. And they have they're all different registers. So I'm just going to ask each student to play their instrument from the lowest key to the highest so you can hear the different register. So this is Tess Monty playing Slentham. Why don't you just go through from low to high there. Good. Now you'll notice when all those instruments are played together, the sound kind of bleeds together, and it almost sounds like a wind chime or something. So there's a technique that you may have noticed of when you're playing this instrument, where your right hand, if you're right-handed, is striking the key, and the left follows behind it and actually mutes it as soon as you play the next key. Could you demonstrate that for us? There, so you can hear how it's much clearer that way. And so all these instruments, that's a required playing technique. Otherwise, it just starts to sound really kind of indistinct and undefined. So this is sometimes, well, this particular instrument, the Slentham, is reserved for the wise person in the group, okay? As is the gong, okay? And then these other instruments are basically progressed from low to high. So we'll have Maddie play the demung here, which is the next lowest octave. All right, and Ariel, why don't you demonstrate the Panarus? Great, okay, and Holly on the Peking. Okay, so those are all really functioning as communicating the core melody of a piece. And pretty much play the same thing. There are times when they may do something different, but for the most part, they're playing the same thing. It's a 5-note scale, okay? Even though these have 7 keys, it's actually just a 5-note scale with 2 keys that have are doubled in terms of the octave. So it's kind of like a pentatonic scale, for those theory buffs out there, but it does not conform to equal temperament. So you cannot find these pitches on a piano, which is also interesting. Roughly, those 5 tones are, if you think of the Western octave as having 12 pitches that are equally divided between in an octave, right? This is the same idea, except it's 5 instead of 12. So you have pitches that are roughly equidistant from each other within that span of an octave. So let's move on to the bonong. These are elaborative instruments that are going to ornament the melody by either playing rhythms in octaves, or in this particular piece, they're also going to demonstrate an interlocking pattern. And this is a characteristic that you find in a lot of gamelan, where 2 musicians are going to play half of a complete kind of melody or complete pattern. And So you need that community in order for the music to really be complete. There's really no soloists in here, if you haven't noticed already. So it's, again, a music that really reflects that emphasis on community. So this one is going to use an interlocking pattern called imbal. And I'm going to ask Nicole and Evan to demonstrate this for you. And you should hear sort of a descending line, but it'll be sort of divided between their two parts. Why don't you guys try that? Yeah, that's it. So you kind of have two halves making a whole there. And so you'll hear that in this next piece we're going to do. Now in the back cam is on the kenon, which is with these instruments punctuating that melody. And he's got the same 5 notes. Why don't you play yours from low to high, or from 1 to 6, whichever. Okay, so similar construction to the bonong. And then this is called the kempul, which also is providing punctuation. And I'll ask Bennett to play those for you. Now, what you'll notice about these gongs is that in the center there's a raised portion. And this is really, well, I should say it was cutting edge technology when it was invented in terms of gong construction. And the word gong in our English language really comes from Southeast Asia, which is where gongs were developed into all these different forms. So at some point they discovered that if you put this raised portion in the middle, you can really focus the sound of that gong. And Bennett, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate this. So on number 1, just play it kind of outside the middle with pretty good, a decent amount of force. Okay, so it almost sounds like a bell. Try it again a little harder. Okay. Now you'll hear the difference when he uses the same amount of force and plays it right in the center. So it really projects, it defines all those indefinite pitches into one, and makes it into a complete, really clear sound. So then we get over here to the big gong, and so you have the big one in the center, and then some secondary gongs. And again, this is the most important instrument in terms of the ensemble as a whole. So Sam, why don't you demonstrate the big gong for us? Quite a sound. It's fun if you, after we're done here, if you want, you can stick your head behind into the gong, and it's like nothing you've ever experienced. Just make sure who's ever playing it doesn't hit it too hard, okay? But it's pretty amazing. So that idea where the least active instrument is the most important role is really, again, reflective of culture, where wisdom and respect isn't necessarily reserved for the person who is the most vocal and active, and in terms of showmanship. It's really, respect there is really given to individuals who are understated and reserved in their demeanor. And I think the music reflects that as well. Okay, so we're going to do a piece now called, Bindri, sorry, yes, Bindri. It's another lanchalong, but it has a little bit different pattern in the middle, like I demonstrated earlier, where we'll have the bonongs get into an interlocking style. And so it'll kind of go forth between the two. So this is Bindri. Give me 1 second here. So, believe it or not, if you see a full Gamelan performance in Java, Central Java, you'll see twice as many instruments. This is only half of a Gamelan. So a full Javanese set will have a second component. So all these will have a pair. And that pair will be actually a different scale, a scale called a Pelog scale, which is a 7-tone scale. So we're only really working with half of an orchestra here, but the pieces you play are either keyed for Slendro or Pelog, so it's almost like, you know, two different keys. And they don't mix, so you would never have a piece that would transition from one to another. Either your piece is in Slendro or Pelog. And sometimes the same piece will be written for both. Another interesting aspect of this music is that it transcends class in an interesting way where, you know, when we visited the court in Yogyakarta, they had some of the most beautiful ornate gamelans there that had been there for hundreds of years, and the court employs, you know, composers that write pieces for the Sultan, and it's a part of everyday court activities. There's a staff gamelan of musicians, court musicians. But then when we did a village homestay just outside of Jogja, the village had its own gamelan. So you really find this music, you know, across those class distinctions, you know, from the highest court to the smallest villages, which is another interesting aspect of it. That's different than a lot of the music here. You can really distinguish music, at least historically, along class lines in terms of music that's considered maybe more elite and others that's more working class and that sort of thing. Okay, well, before we do, we have one more piece, but I'd like to open it up for any questions anyone here might have about the music or.
What's the meter? I'm trying to figure out the meter, as in beats per cycle or measure one.
Sure, yeah, good question. Typically, it's going to be organized in groupings of 8. This particular type of piece, these types of pieces, I should say, lancharons, have a, you could call it sort of an 8-beat cycle that's then repeated a number of times, but that's kind of your main cycle or part, is sort of these 8 beats. So you may have a piece that has, for a full cycle, it's kind of 5 different melodies that run through those 8 beats. You know, now there are different pieces like La Drame is a cycle of 32, and so it's a longer, more complex piece. If you have a Buberon, that's another piece that's about 16 cycles. So the types of pieces are really organized around that aspect of it. You know, how many main beats there are, and the main beats you can usually tell because it's the notes that are being played by these melody instruments right here. But it's very much that kind of 8-beat cycle. Definitely a duple sort of feel. There's not until you get to more contemporary pieces do you find kind of a triple meter or you know, groupings of 3. It's usually groupings of 2. Yeah, good question. Yes.
In the is this traditionally learned as an oral tradition or a notated tradition?
That's another good question. You said, is it learned as an oral tradition or a written tradition? And traditionally, definitely an oral tradition where you would learn basically children sitting on their parents' laps, you know, playing a saran or maybe playing bonong, and you would sort of give the patterns down for the different pieces. What's interesting now in Java, the pieces have gotten so complex that they have started writing them down. And it coincided with ethnomusicologists from Europe and America going and to study, and they couldn't remember all these pieces. So they developed a notation of cipher notation using numbers. After we're done here, you're welcome to come up and we can show you a piece of music, but it's basically numbers 1 through 5. The written on the instruments themselves, but also organized in the music. And when we were in Java, they were using that cipher notation to teach music, because some of these pieces can go on for a long time. I should mention that oftentimes this music accompanies dance, okay? Another thing that accompanies is shadow puppetry, which is an art form with a long history, where you have these puppets that are carved out of buffalo hide, placed in front of a screen with a light shining behind it, and they do theater, mainly performances of two old Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And these will go on for 8 to 10 hours. Starting, we went to one the first time we were there, and it started around 9 or 10 p.m. and it wrapped up around 5 a.m. And people will sleep and then wake up and then sleep, but the musicians are playing for 8 hours. But anyway, all that music now is usually written down. What's interesting is you go to Bali, they still do everything by rote, by oral tradition. And they consider it as a badge of honor. And I've even heard Balinese musicians sort of make fun of the Javanese style because they use notation. But so in Bali, they do still do it primarily without written music. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Is the clothing you're wearing native to the area?
Good question. Yeah, I meant to explain this. Yeah, typically if you see a Javanese performance, all the musicians will be wearing sarongs, which are just long cloths that are then tied around the waist like this. These sarongs were actually made by the Warren Wilson Fiber Arts crew, so I kind of commissioned them, you could say, for this particular ensemble. But it's traditional to wear sarongs. It's also traditional not to wear shoes, okay, when you perform. You know, when we rehearse twice a week, you know, we all remove our shoes. We don't wear sarongs when we rehearse, but we do take our shoes off. That's, again, out of respect for the instruments and sort of, and their nature, you know, this sort of spiritual nature that is believed to inhabit them. The other thing that I tell the students not to do is step over the instrument. So, you know, we have them positioned around the room, but you really shouldn't walk right over it. My teacher had a funny story where the first time he went to study gamelan in Bali, he came out to the pendopo in the morning, which is sort of a gazebo, and he went to his instrument and he stepped over one, and the teacher was like, "Oh, don't step over the instrument. No, we don't do that." And he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Then he stepped over the one. But yeah, that's another thing we do in terms of performance practice. Remove our shoes, refrain from stepping over the instrument, wear sarongs. Yeah, that's a good question. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are the longer ones there, are they suspended on ropes? Is that what I'm saying?
Yes, so if you, or lift up one that's facing the audience maybe, and you can see that, yeah, they're just strung with twine that holds them up, yeah. You know, some people think that these gongs started as actual cooking receptacles, you know, pots, literally. That's at least, there's some scholars that argue that's where the origins of that particular instrument, because it's an interesting gong, for sure. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So if they're not tuned to equal temperament, is it just intonation? Or?
It's a different tuning system altogether, and there's no fixed pitch reference either. So it doesn't necessarily follow, you know, what you might think of as Pythagorean tuning either. It's kind of its own thing, really, which is why it may sound slightly off. There's a couple pieces that I do at times where we collaborate with. I've got one that features it's a trumpet solo, but the trumpet players have a hard time because they have to try to fit their melodies with this instrument. And there's another one, it's an arrangement of a fiddle tune, but you know, we have to tune the fiddle kind of somewhere in the neighborhood of D, but not quite there. So it's, and that, again, again, that reference moves around, it's not fixed. So it's really unique, is what it is. Yeah. Fascinating sound.
So would each set be kind of a little bit different?
Slightly different, yeah. It's probably in the neighborhood, but different enough that, again, you couldn't necessarily put interchange pieces. And again, that's kind of part of the idea to keep these instruments together as one unit. Yeah, in the back.
Are they ever like heated to create like a warmer sound?
Did you say heated?
Yes.
I mean, certainly when they're made, it's very hot. I don't know, afterwards, no, unless, to tune them, you don't really have to heat them. So to tune these, you can cold forge them, is sort of the term. But really, if you look at this key here, you'll notice that it's slightly bent, sort of convex, I guess you could say. But if Maddie, if you hold up your lowest key there, you'll notice that that's pretty flat compared to this one. And that's one way to tune these bars, is to bend them. So when you bend them, it raises the pitch. Another way to tune them is to remove metal. So if you remove metal from the middle, it'll actually lower the pitch. Interestingly, if you remove metal from the ends, it'll raise the pitch. So that's another way that you can tune these bars, because they will go out of tune. I don't know about heating them. Maybe that's something we should try. Take it down to the Warren Wilson has a blacksmith shop, so maybe we'll take these down there and heat them up and see what happens. Probably not. These are all made mostly of iron, which is sort of a low budget set. The high budget sets are made of bronze. The only bronze instruments we have is the Slemton. These are bronze keys, and then that middle gong that Bennett demonstrated earlier is a bronze gong. And that's, if you want a nice set, you get the solid bronze. But if you see people make the big gongs, it's quite a sight. You have 3 or 4 craftsmen, wrangling this huge piece of metal, out of this bed of hot coals and pounding on it, and it's pretty amazing craft for sure. Any other questions?
What did you say the set was called?
The name, it translates to Venerable Night Lightning. And all the sets start with venerable. So it's always ki something. And in this case, Venerable Night Lightning. Will Peoples has a set of his own. It's actually a Gamelan Ensemble, and he calls it Ki Gunung Biru, which means Venerable Blue Mountain. Because he teaches at Western, so they're right there in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Well, we should probably do this last piece now. This last one, I'm going to ask for some help from you all, okay? Just to kind of demonstrate the interlocking pattern, there's a little participation clapping pattern that we can do, and I've asked Justin to help me with this. It's very simple, don't worry, I do it with elementary school children, so you will not have a problem. But it's kind of a fun way just to kind of feel how it is to have, 2 patterns that fit together. So we'll do that, and then we'll play this last piece for you. So we're going to divide the room. We'll do Manyar Sewu if you want to get down this aisle. And so this pattern kind of goes along. I paired it with words to make it easier. And it goes like this. Let's see. Orange, apple, peach. Orange, apple, peach. Okay, and that's it. We'll try it. There we go. I'll get it going. It might help actually if you can stand up here and kind of come down, and then I'll go over there. So it goes like this. Orange, apple, peach. Orange, apple, peach. do that during this piece, during a couple cycles. I'm going to get them started, and then we'll come out here and we can all make music together. How about that? Ready? If you want to come up and just check out the instruments or talk to any of us, feel free. And have a great day.